Technology, it's always glitching little ways. It's what we live with, though. It's kind of a part of what we get used to with this modern world. Is there's times where your cell phone dies, and there's times where the internet doesn't work, and there's times where the screen on the back of the room goes dead. And it's funny how we all have this kind of rhythm that we've learned to live in, and it changes. A lot of what we do and a lot of how we approach our lives, I think it's not so much that it gets shaped by huge traumas that we've had. Some of us it is. But for most of us, it's not like what shapes our lives and our spirituality and our relationships is so much from traumas, but just the water we drink in the culture from day to day, the expectations that come with the family that we're born to and the life that we live in a particular place. What shapes us is often so subtle that we don't ever question it. We don't ever notice it. We don't even wonder if life could be a little bit richer. You know, there's that little bit of kind of questioning it that you see in movies, like even old movies like The Wizard of Oz, you know, where Dorothy begins to question whether, really, you know, is this all there is? And then suddenly she finds herself in Oz, and it's kind of a cultural message in that movie that you need to just kind of accept where you are. I mean, the one thing I don't like about that movie so much is it always seems to come down to there's no place like home. So beware, you people who might go do something, you know, or ask bigger questions or seek bigger answers or want life to somehow be lived in a little bit more delicious way. You're probably going to run into witches and scarecrows and flying monkeys. And eventually, you may find a wizard that says, just click your heels and go home. There's a little bit of that in that kind of cultural sense that you're supposed to live this particular way. We all know that those who want to question the cultural norms, the cultural social mores, as we call them, are probably going to run into some resistance along the way because, frankly, we really don't want people making us question those things that have been taken for granted. Don't go mucking around with things. So whenever biblical scholars start questioning things like the virgin birth or did, you know, Moses actually call down manna from heaven, and they come up with all these explanations for why that happened. There's a big part of us that's just like, TMI, we really don't want to know. I don't want to know about evolution. I don't want to know about stuff about the way human beings' consciousness works. I want to just be happy and live my life in this comfort of a cultural bubble. Unfortunately, for many of us, that cultural bubble becomes something that is no longer possible. It becomes constrictive. The way that we've learned to live our lives begins to encroach on something inside of us that knows there needs to be some greater living, some bigger birth, that the expectations that I've inherited from my family or my culture just don't seem true or full enough for the life gift that I've been given. And so people begin to be born in some new way. They begin to launch out in some new way, and sometimes they get kind of stomped back in by those who would find their choices uncomfortable. But sometimes they get labeled things other than troublemaker, rabble-rouser. Sometimes they get stamped as artists, poets, cultural creatives. That's a fairly new term, cultural creatives. It kind of emerged about 20 years ago. And they started talking about who are the cultural creatives. There's kind of these people who tend to want to kind of push the boundaries for something richer, fuller, more just, perhaps, more fair. Challenge the expectations. How many of you are cultural creatives? Yeah, no, you can put your hand up if you want. There are a few of you who are going, yeah, I would put my hand up, but that would be a little narcissistic. I don't want to think of myself as too creative or too culturally creative. I mean, really, what have I done? Have I done anything I could call cultural creative? Just being here, you're a cultural creative, my friends. You showed up at 11:11. This is not the standard bubble. But I happen to think Jesus was a cultural creative. In fact, if you read his stuff, what you find is over and over again, he's saying stuff like, he's challenging the status quo. He's challenging the way people are thinking about their lives. He's challenging the way they relate to each other. He's even challenging overarching social systems and suggesting that they have lost their way, they've lost their humanity, they've lost something about what it means to be fully human and fully alive. He's talking about that. Sometimes when he talks about it, he says stuff like this. He says, you got to find your way to that narrow gate, because the way is wide that leads to the stuff you don't want. And I got to thinking about that narrow gate. I really wonder if I can really sense something about what he might have meant if those were his words of the narrow gate. And what is that? I think perhaps it has something to do with being able to be a cultural creative, being willing to risk challenging some of the things that you have been pre-programmed to experience as the way life is supposed to be. That there is something of a second birth for us that we can go through that is more about living from the inside out than the programming that we receive from the outside in. It's more about risking the possibility that, like in the invitation that Elizabeth read for us, that I might disappoint someone to be true to what I sense is true for me. To live from the inside out is something that is not kind of the norm in a society. And cultural creatives, I believe, kind of go into this path of trying to live in a different way that feels more true in their experience. But there's some problems that happen for cultural creatives. And if you don't believe that, look at the story of Jesus. But you don't even have to look there to see how so many problems emerge sometimes for those of us who begin to work towards some new way of opening up life, or feel some calling to the richness of life that has been somehow robbed by those just automatic, we had them, they were in the water we drank as we grew up, expectations. In fact, the news is full of cultural creatives who don't find the narrow gate, but instead get lost in fame and celebrity and addiction and sometimes the exhibitionism of a culture caught up in appearances. We see cultural creatives every day, actors, singers, poets, musicians, counter-revolutionaries, artists, who instead of finding a way to a life that feels more whole, more rich, more open, and more human, find themselves lost in paths that lead to stuck patterns that are less whole than those of that cultural norm. It's a risk that people begin to take when they question. I think just a thought that there may be the possibility that how we enter to this path and how honest we are to ourselves about this path of living from the inside out is the important thing. Whenever living from the inside out gets lost and put to the side when compared to something about fame or need for popularity, or all of the things that help us hide from our own insecurities and fragile parts of us, we become easily brought down into the less human, the less, well, the parts of that aren't about our higher selves. What does it take for us as a culture to find that narrow gate? Paul maybe said it in this whole idea of don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, which is your spiritual worship. Renewing of our minds. Maybe, the practice that we need is to gather regularly with people who want to not live out of the same conformity to norms that somehow rob us of more wholeness, but want to look beyond that to what feels true and fair. But to create an environment with other people where there is encouragement to live from the inside out, even if what you're living out isn't all that finished yet. Even if what you're living out feels wounded and shaky and broken or fragile, where are you going to find that place, where you can let that begin to happen? Because frankly, a lot of what gets kind of passed is art. What gets passed is truth and beauty. In our culture is not what I'm talking about. Because what I'm talking about has less to do with a hit song than it has to do with a 20-year-old who just wants to sing. It has a whole lot more to do with the artist inside of everybody and not some few who have perfected a technique. It has more to do with allowing whatever the voice of the moment is to be spoken out of my heart, even if it ends up being something that's not all that important and possibly not what I think about later. But to be free enough to live from the inside out, to open ourselves up to that risk, even if it's not what people want to hear, even if it's the unpopular voice of the prophet, those cultural creatives of old who saw something was wrong with their culture and they needed to say something about it. They felt called to speak. Maybe you have that word. Maybe that word's in you to speak to someone about where wholeness has been lost. Maybe that word is in everyone in this place to speak truth to power or to confront those who would dominate others for their own profit. Maybe that word's in me. But I don't need someone else's words to speak. And you don't either. Whatever that is inside of you, that creative voice, that's your gift. Maybe what we need is a community that invites us to speak it, that supports it, and that says every week, whatever you said last week, whether it was true or not, it doesn't matter. Right now, what is it through the renewing of our minds that we come to discover? Life is always about growing. Communities have to grow. People have to change. But we're held sometimes in these constrictions, and we expect that people will just follow the line. I know you know from your own past that the places where you did the most growing were almost always in the places where you felt the most support and care to be whatever to whoever you needed to be. And so I'm just suggesting today something may call you to renew your mind. That's your worship. Your worship is really about opening up to letting change happen. To gather around this altar is to open ourselves to be altered. It's to let something new emerge from the inside. Where are your growing edges right now? What's your limit to your own joy? You know, what's the water you've been drinking that just automatically defines things? Maybe salvation, or in maybe that word, what that means is wholeness, is waiting just outside of the bubble.